Good evening. On behalf of all of us at the Library of Virginia, the Library of Virginia Foundation, and the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, I'm delighted to welcome you to this evening's Art in Literature, the Mary Lynn Kotz Award program. I'm Sandy Treadway. I'm the director of the Library of Virginia, and I'm delighted that you could join us this evening. This event is one in a series of events we've been doing all week, celebrating writers in the literary tradition, and I hope you've been able to view some of the programs. If not, they are archived and available on the library's YouTube website, and I hope you'll check them out. The Art and Literature Award was inspired by an amazing woman named Mary Lynn Kotz. Mary Lynn is an award-winning author and was a long-time contributing editor to Art News magazine. Mary Lynn has devoted all of her life to writing about art in a way that it is accessible to wide audiences. She's the author, among many other works, of Upstairs at the White House, My Years with the First Ladies, and Rauschenberg, An Art in Life, released in its updated third edition in 2018. Mary Lynn has attended all of our previous Art and Literature Award programs, and always at her side every year was her talented and devoted husband, Nick Kotz. Nick, a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and author, passed away suddenly at his farm in Northern Virginia this past spring. We know that Nick is with us in spirit tonight, and he will be sorely missed. Now, the idea for this award actually began in conversations back in 2011, when several of us at the library, the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, author Catherine Neville, and a few other writers who care deeply about art, realized that there was no existing award to recognize a literary work whose primary subject was art or an artist. And we ought to do something about that. So we started in 2012 to see what the reception to the program might be. The Virginia Museum selected 12 outstanding works of art, and the library identified 12 poets willing to write a piece about that work of art. And we had a program featuring that work, and the response was outstanding. So the following year, we established this juried award to recognize a book in any genre that exemplifies the best in this unique field. And the past winners of this award are a very distinguished group indeed. Orhan Pamuk, a Nobel Prize winner for The Innocence of Objects, Carolyn Kreuter-Ferranda for The Embrace, Susan Vreeland for Lisette's List, Patrick Horrigan for Portraits at an Exhibition, Dawn Tripp for Georgia, Donna Lucy for Sargent's Women, and last year, Mary Gabriel for 9th Street Women. Many people have helped make this award possible, but chief among them is Alex Nargis, director of the state's crown jewel, the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, and Lee Vivret-Separich, director of the VMFA library. Lee graciously coordinates the adjudication process for the award every year. We're grateful to Alex, Lee, and everyone at the VMFA for this cherished partnership that has made the Art and Literature Award such a success. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce Michael Taylor, Chief Curator and Deputy Director for Art and Education at the VMFA. Michael, an accomplished museum administrator, curator, author, and expert on modern and contemporary art, joined the leadership team at the VMFA in 2015, and we are so fortunate to have him at the museum and with us tonight. Michael will introduce the winner of the 2020 Art and Literature Award, If you love art and you love literature, I know you will enjoy tonight's program. So thank you for being here. And Michael, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Sandy. That was a lovely introduction. And yes, it's a pleasure to be here. And what an amazing book that won this year's prize. And it gives me great pleasure to tell you a bit more about the author. So Philip J. Deloria is the author of Becoming Mary Sully, Toward an American Indian Abstract. He's a leading authority of American studies and Native American history, and he's a professor of history at Harvard University. He received his PhD in American Studies from Yale University in 1994, and then taught for 6 years at the University of Colorado before moving to the University of Michigan, where he taught from 2001 to 2017. In January 2018, he was appointed as Harvard University's first tenured professor of Native American history. Deloria, who is of Dakota Sioux descent, is also a trustee of the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of the American Indian, where he chairs the Repatriation Committee. He is a former president of the American Studies Association, an elected member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and, along with Erica Doss, Deloria is the co-editor of the Culture America series at the University Press of Kansas. He's also the author of 2 prize-winning books and co-editor of 2 other volumes, as well as the author of numerous essays, articles, and reviews. His first book, Playing Indian, which came out in 1998, traced the long-standing and pervasive tradition of white people dressing up as Native Americans from the Boston Tea Party to the New Age movement. While his 2004 book, Indians in Unexpected Places, examined the contributions of Native Americans to modern life in the early 20th century, including film, sports, cars, and music. In 2004, Deloria was the co-editor with Neil Salisbury of A Companion to American Indian History, and more recently, he co-authored with Alexander I. Olson, American Studies, A User Guide, which was published in 2017. Tonight, Philip Deloria will discuss his latest book, Becoming Mary Sully, Toward an American Indian Abstract, the winner of this year's Mary Lynn Kotz Award. An astonishing contribution to art history and cultural studies, this publication brings to light the life and work of Deloria's great-aunt Mary Sully, as well as her sister Ella Deloria, an important anthropologist and linguist. I'm going to end there and let Philip tell you more about the lives of these extraordinary women and their contributions to art.
Thank you so very much. How mi takuyepi iuha chante washtea nape che yuzepelo. Phil Deloria imachiapi. I greet you all with a good heart, and I want to say how honored I am by this award, and how gratified and how pleased and humbled I am by this. This has, I think, been the project of my career, and largely because the artist Mary Sully is so extraordinary, and I'm really looking forward to sharing some of her work with you tonight. I wish that we could be there together, all of us in person. But the trade-off for that is I know that there's folks who are with us tonight who would not ordinarily be here, including my mom, my brother, I think my sister, and perhaps other members of my family. I'm coming to you from Michigan, from northern Michigan, Odawa territory. And since this is a book about art, I'm going to start and very quickly go to this PowerPoint, and I'm going to show you a number of images. Indeed, I simply want to start by showing you some of the pictures. I think one of the things that's really useful to understand about this art is when you see one of them, you think, well, that's really interesting. When you see 8 or 10 of them, you think, well, that's really quite interesting. And when you see 134 of them, which is the number in the collection, you know, it's, I think, quite an astonishing and overwhelming kind of project. So as you can see here, the form of these pieces, it's the same with all of them. She established a form in which there would be 3 panels. Top panel is somewhat representational, somewhat abstract, sometimes symbolic. Second panel is much more of a regularized, symmetrical kind of design pattern. The third panel is always a little bit smaller, tends to be a really complicated. This was a book falling off my shelf. It tends to be a complicated kind of image that blends together some of the themes and the icons that you find in the first image. So, for example, with the last one you saw Babe Ruth and the theme of diamonds for baseball sort of emerging here, Lupe Velez. You can see this really delightful perspective that Mary Sully has taken, sort of this overhead shot with Lupe Velez's hair and the dress kind of unfolding with these sort of like triangular and spiky kind of shapes, which are then taken and reworked in the second panel, then turned into something like a quilt design almost in the bottom panel. Here, Alfred Lunt and Lynn Fontaine, major American theatrical performers of the early to mid 20th century. What's interesting here, I think, is the sort of preponderance of the color lavender, the purples here. Lunt and Fontaine had what was called a lavender marriage, sort of a marriage of convenience to sort of serve as a cover for his homosexuality. But what you can see, I think, interesting is the sort of stairway at the top, the stairway that ascends to stardom on the part of both of them. And that this was a stardom that was all about their partnership. Then converted into a design. Mary Sully oftentimes thought of these as having an industrial design kind of character. There was a sense that perhaps they might be marketable as wallpaper or tile or linoleum patterns. And then interestingly, the bottom panel is two parfleche boxes in Native American sort of utility form that had lots of aesthetic value attached to it. So there are native themes in those bottom panels, and there's themes that are sometimes somewhat less native. Here, Allison Skipworth, an artist, and Mary Sully has taken the pun of skipping a rock across a stream or a lake, turned it into one of these sort of delightful three-panel designs. Sometimes throughout the evening, I'm going to sort of shift the presentation of these, and I just wanted to give you an example of that, simply to put more of the image on the screen, to have larger kinds of images. So you can see when I do, the top panel will always be on the upper left. So here's just a sort of summary of them quickly. 134 of these created between the late 1920s. I think 1927 or 28 was the first one. In the mid-1940s, it's a little hard to know exactly when she stopped making them. 3-part works. Her medium was colored pencil and paper. Every once in a while, she would take white tempera paint or sometimes a little gilt and sort of add a little bit of additional color to them. It's interesting to see that she develops, as an artist, as a master of the colored pencil, over time. Her first images have a lot of empty and negative space, and her later images are very, very full and rich. She became quite interested, I think, in working with texture on paper, sort of shifting the colored pencil around in different kinds of ways. And each of them represents a personality. She called the project the Personality Prints Project. So each represents a personality drawn from popular culture, sometimes from the Episcopal Church, where she was a quite devoted sort of member, and also sometimes concepts and ideas that sort of show up here in the personality prints. So here she is, Mary Sully. She was quite an interesting person, grew up in the kind of colonial sort of world of the Episcopal Church in South Dakota. Her father was a native clergyman at Standing Rock, on the Standing Rock Reservation. She went to the All Saints boarding school for girls, which was a kind of school for elite young women in South Dakota. She struggled after that, however. She tried to attend college at the University of Kansas. Was not really quite very successful at that. Over the course of her life, she grew more and more reclusive. I've sometimes thought of her as a kind of native visual arts Emily Dickinson type, who sort of retreated back to her bedroom and oftentimes was reluctant to come out and talk to people. As the daughter of a clergyman, she sometimes, when she went up to take communion, she would sort of fall down and have something like a bit of an epileptic fit, perhaps. So she had something interesting going on with her own personality and her own sort of mental and psychological health. It's interesting because her name was Susan Deloria, that she adopted the name Mary Sully as the name under which she would make art. And this actually comes from her family, from a very interesting kind of family history. I'd like to point you quickly to this pairing here, Alfred Sully and Pehun Dutawin, my great-great-grandmother. Alfred Sully was himself an artist. Was involved in the Mexican-American War, where he did a lot of pencil sketches. But he took up oils, and he was actually, for an amateur artist, quite a talented person. This is one of his paintings here on the left. Even more interesting, perhaps, for thinking about why she chose the name Sully was that Alfred Sully's father was Thomas Sully, who was probably one of the foremost portrait painters of antebellum U.S. He painted a lot of the celebrities of his day, and in that sense, her project and his project have a lot of overlap. They both painted sort of famous celebrity folks. You were quite likely to have a Thomas Sully perhaps in your wallet, because the Andrew Jackson portrait that he painted is the one that was the model for the $20 bill. One of the really wonderful things about this book was the reuniting of these three paintings. In April 1857, Alfred Sully sent a letter to his father, Thomas Sully, a box actually. He said, "I'm enclosing 3 canvases and 1 pair of moccasins." And the canvases represent these 2 young women who he called right, likable young girls. One of those women was my great-grandmother, Peihan Dutuan, or Peihan Lutuan. Those are 2 dialectical differences in the Dakota and Lakota language, where D and L are sometimes substituted. So Peihan Lutuan, or Peihan Dutuan, the name translates as red crane woman. And you can see them most clearly in the lower right, sort of posed together. If you move up above that, you can see them again in this sort of image of a Sioux camp. And if you move over to the black and white study print, you can see them over on the left side, kind of just tucked in there between a horse and a person. So he was painting these women a lot, and in fact, established some kind of relationship with Peihan Dutuan that actually produced a child, Mary Sully Bordeaux, also known as Akichitawin, soldier woman. And she was then the mother of my grandfather, Vine Deloria Sr., and my 2 great aunts, Ella Cara Deloria and Susan Mabel Deloria, our artist. So here we have her once again, and I'm not quite sure why I put that slide in, but this is the kind of art that would have been present in the world of native arts between the late 20s and the 1930s and early 1940s. And you can see that it's not at all like the kind of art that she was producing. Flat, 2-dimensional, kind of plain backgrounds, traditional kinds of themes, and 3 different kinds of schools of artists who were working, all producing somewhat similar kinds of things. If we were to go to the sort of wider world of American art, we'd find social realism, we'd find regionalism, we'd find precisionism, Art Deco, the mural tradition, and giving way to abstraction. So none of the work that she does really fits in any of these categories. She's sort of a quite exceptional person, I think, and her art is quite exceptional relative to these other traditions. In fact, I see her actually looking back to the traditions of abstraction that come out of the aughts and the teens. I've been really struck, and in the book I do kind of a sort of lengthy speculative analysis of the relationships between some of her works and an artist like Marsden Hartley, who was painting these sort of abstracts on Indian themes. You can see here that he's chosen these themes of teepees. If you look on the left, you can see one of her really, really quite stunning images, the Indian church, that she too has chosen the theme of the teepee, although she's made it quite interesting. It's a kind of visual pun where the flaps of the teepee, those 2 brown kind of long elongated triangles look like the flaps of a teepee into which Native women are moving. Turns out that these are sort of the folds of a robe that a clergyman is actually wearing and sort of draping down. But it's quite clearly a teepee. And you can see the sort of inner world of the teepee that she does and the inner worlds of the teepees that Marsden Hartley sort of operates. So this in some ways feels a bit like the tradition that she's coming out of. She was really, I think, quite masterful at imagining multiple kinds of meanings. So here you can see Amelia Earhart. The center of the top image has what looks like a sort of propeller for an airplane. And those sort of triangular forms may be the sort of shapes that a propeller makes as it moves through the air. But they may also be spotlights, because Amelia Earhart was quite attuned to her own celebrity. And if we look at the middle panel, we can see that perhaps the spotlight theme is actually the more compelling. Here she's taken the the form of music and linked it to color. And this was something that happened a lot in her work. I have a little section in the book where I sort of speculate about the possibility that she may have had synesthesia, perhaps as either a physiological condition or as an aesthetic kind of project, to have sensory kinds of crossings between color and sound in this case. So you can see that the fingers of Mildred Dilling are sort of laced with color, strumming on these harp strings. In the second panel, you can see how it turns into this sort of glissading kind of harpy, kind of thing. But in the bottom, there's a kind of Art Deco almost sort of look to the curves of the harp. Here's some of the many sort of church themes that she did. Bishop Rowe, who was famous for traveling across Alaska, and sort of the light of Christ sort of showing up in a candle and in a sort of igloo kind of theme. The bottom panel taking on a sort of centered of the paper kind of symmetry, rotational symmetry, right? That almost reminds you of a kaleidoscope, and not entirely possible that she was not thinking and looking at kaleidoscopes. This, I think, is one of the most challenging and interesting and most beautiful images. And it points to the way that understanding something about the subject actually unlocks some of the image. So I spent a long time sort of thinking that this was, if you look at the top panel of the upper left, you can see, I thought this was sort of a human trilobite kind of figure. There's obviously musical notes involved, and Lawrence Tibbett was a singer. But I saw those two kind of pink things about, sort of 3/4 of the way from the bottom of the page. I saw those as eyes, and I saw those yellow elongated things as arms, and it was sort of trilobite-ish, and I couldn't make sense of it until I discovered that Lawrence Tibbett had actually had a cabin in a place called Temescal Canyon outside of Los Angeles, and there was a stage in this canyon, and he would stand out on the stage in this little amphitheater, and he would sing, and the notes would echo out of the canyon. And suddenly what I realized was that this trilobite thing, which had risen to the sort of center of the page, was actually the background. And what I was seeing was notes emanating from a canyon. And suddenly all of those stripes of colors, I realized, were sedimentary rocks representing the nature of the canyon. And then curiously, in the second panel, she's flipped this upside down and put it in a repeating pattern as if she's looking through a keyhole, through a camera obscura almost. And you can tell that it's upside down by sort of the sedimentary layers at the top of each one of those little Easter eggs, and the blue sky at the bottom, which sort of echoes the sky from the top. And then we're back to the kaleidoscope kind of form. One of her major influences, and a really, really important person in this story, is her sister Ella Deloria, who was working for Franz Boas at Columbia University in sort of the beginning moments of sort of American anthropology, particularly as it developed in the 1930s around a school of anthropology called Culture and Personality. Ruth Benedict, shown there in the lower right corner, her book, Patterns of Culture in 1934, was really the sort of foundational text for thinking about this. And it was all about the same kind of project that Mary Sully was engaged in, thinking about culture and thinking about individuals in relation to culture and how the two developed. So Ella was part of this world, and I think she carried this world quite easily back home, where Mary Sully also engaged in this intellectual kind of discourse and debate. In fact, one could argue that those middle patterns take on some of the dimensions of patterns of culture themselves. Here's a list from 1938 that the sisters assembled. They were trying to put together kind of a promotional package. And so we can tell some of the things that were done by 1938. There's about 20-some images that were done after 1938. And so we can at least sort of identify some of her later style in some of these images. As you've probably seen, she's quite interested and quite good at doing sort of visual and optical kinds of tricks with the image. And here you can see this baseball in the center. And there's this curious colored kind of lifesaver disc, almost, that sort of surrounds it. And then we can see the sort of white and sort of pinstripes of a baseball uniform. If you take the stitching on the ball and match it up to the stitching on the pinstripes that are behind that colored disc, and then let your eye play, what happens is that the ball actually seems to move. It comes off of that background and sort of comes at you as if you were at a 3D show at a Disney amusement park. And then, of course, the middle panel turns into the Apple computer's colored spinning wheel of death, which I've unfortunately had appear on my computer once or twice too often. Kind of comforting and interesting to me to think that she may have actually invented that. When these images first came into our family in the mid-1970s, my mom and I opened the box and we sort of looked at these things, and some of them we could make a little bit of sense of, but many of them we couldn't. And that was in part because we did not know who many of these folks were. So just to give you an example of how understanding who the person is can unlock the art, here's Malcolm Campbell. He was a speed race car driver and actually drove boats as well. His cars were all called the Bluebird. They're super cool looking cars from the 1930s. Just kind of amazing. And you can see him there with his driving goggles. When you look at the image, you can see there's a blue bird at the crossing of two roads, or kind of a speed track. There's four wheels and kind of an exhaust at the rear of the bird. You can see the driving goggles there below, and you can see these use of color, right? Color as sort of like representing his dreams of speed, the emotion and the affect that's attached to driving fast. And then the second panel, she converts that into kind of a Celtic electron sort of look, right? You can see the bird at the center, but the speed tracks themselves have become the central visual element. And we can see speed taking shape. And then we've got something that has a kind of arts and crafts or sort of deco feel, down below, but we can still see the bird now figured as something of a thunderbird almost kind of figure. This one, Dr. Defoe, is, to my mind, one of the most beautiful images in the set. Everything in sets of 5: moon, cloud, house, halo, tree, umbrella, cats, flowers. Understanding that Dr. Defoe was the person who delivered the Dion quintuplets suddenly helps us make sense of this lovely kind of image. So one of the things I've tried to do in thinking about how to make sense of these images is to kind of figure out a kind of visual vocabulary that she may have seen or experienced or felt, and may have made their way into her art. And so I'm just going to walk through a bunch of things that might have been part of that vocabulary. And what I've tried to do is give you some examples, and then in one of the corners, added one of her images. So this is the Parfleche tradition of Great Plains Native women's paintings. You see that the color palette is very consistent, the triangular and diamond shapes as well. The different kinds of challenges in quill work and beadwork also took shape, converting native traditions pretty directly and pretty explicitly in many cases into the art that she was making. Quilting, which became really central to Native women and Great Plains women's arts traditions in the 19th and early 20th century, also takes shape in the images. And she was at Standing Rock at a very interesting moment where Native women started adopting the pictographic style, which had previously been the domain of men. And there are two really signal women artists here, Edith Claymore and Nellie Two Bear Gates, who were producing these beautiful valises and suitcases and purses with pictographic kind of work. And you can see that Mary Sully started doing something similar as well. Her sister Ella had her do ethnographic illustration, and it's quite clear that some of these illustrations you can see on the left made their way into the personality prints. And of course, she had a model for the entire project of personality. Time magazine started publishing in 1923, carried on its cover the image of a significant personality, many of whom made their way into her work. Some of her later works in particular, as she started to draw the human figure with more regularity, seemed to me to have a great deal of resonance with the comics tradition, that of the graphic novel. She loved film. The Busby Berkeley musicals, this sort of symmetry kind of makes its way, I think, into many of her pieces. One of the great fun things about this book was discovering this image in the upper right, a Busby Berkeley birthday cake with women sort of arrayed symmetrically around it, which is almost exactly how she represents the Ziegfeld image down below. So the resonances of this were just so striking and amazing to me. Many people have pointed out the nature of the symmetry, kind of making them think of these images in terms of Rorschach cards. And of course, interestingly, she was herself underwent a certain course of sort of psychological therapy in the mid-1920s. It wasn't extensive, but it was interesting. There were a number of opportunities for vernacular designers to sort of jump into contests in the 1920s. And here's an example of things from the Staley Silks company, where you can see these are major designers, but contests in women's magazines where you could submit designs. And my sense is that Mary Sully may have been involved in things like that. And of course, I've mentioned arts and crafts before. I think you can see this in many of the images. She's also, though, in dialogue with at least one and more, I think, of the prominent artists of the day. And the figure who really stands out in this regard is Charles Demuth, whose most famous image, I saw the figure 5 in gold, I suspect many of you are familiar with. It's a personality, a portrait, or poster portrait, as Demuth called them, of the poet William Carlos Williams. It's drawn from a poem in which he talks about a fire engine racing towards him during a rainy night. And you can see the 5, the number 5, coming towards him, the figure 5 in gold. She was interested in the same kinds of things, these sort of stop time, stop motion, stop space kinds of things as well. And interestingly, the two of them painted at least 3 of the same people. Here's Demuth and Mary Sully, both representing Gertrude Stein. They also did Eugene O'Neill. So one of the arguments in the book is that these images are best read, or most likely read, or most evocatively read from the top to the bottom, and that the bottom panels represent something that I've called the American Indian abstract, which is not simply native designs and patterns. It's clearly more than that. It's clearly not just a sort of set of quotations of various kind of other cosmopolitan sources, but which is a new and generative and innovative kind of structure of abstraction, right, that draws on native themes but is not confined by them, right, which is in that sense modern in a way that we haven't really thought about, I think, before. So when I say towards the American Indian abstract, these are the kinds of panels that I'm thinking about and talking about. And part of the argument to the book is that there is inevitably going to be a politics to this kind of thing, and that the movement of images as you read them from top to bottom may have something to say about that. She only did 3 images that actually had native, sort of explicit native content: the Indian church, which I've sort of already mentioned here, shown on the left, and Bishop Hare, shown on the right, which is really quite a fascinating thing, one of these sort of visual puns that she's interested in. So Bishop Hare was the Episcopal bishop of South Dakota. And you can see in the top image, right, where Bishop Hare is a man. You can see this through the sort of cut that forms the legs at the bottom of the cross, representing the church, the cross form itself, but also a bird, the clipped wings at the top. And of course, this refers to Lakota people's name for him, Zikala Duzahan, sort of swift bird, or traveling bird. And then there's this image, Indian history, which I've taken as kind of the master key for thinking about how to read all of these images, or at least to read the politics out of these images. You can see that there's no way that the middle image has any pretensions to be a design panel or anything like that. It is fully committed to making an aesthetic kind of statement here. And so what she's doing is tracing history from the bottom of this top panel, that is to say the image of idyllic Indian women engaged in Native women's kind of activities. Then the sort of desperation of the reservation drawn in graphite. And then these curious sort of figures of modernist angst, these silhouetted figures who are literally being crushed down by these feet, the feet of modern industrial, America, right? And you can see this sort of toxic smog swirling, among the feet. When I see this kind of image, I'm reading it in terms of folks like Diego Rivera, Aaron Douglas, perhaps Jacob Lawrence, these sort of silhouetted figures of modernist anxiety. She had access, interestingly, as part of her life in New York City and South Dakota, traveling with her sister, to the works of all of these folks. And so I don't think it's crazy to think that perhaps the silhouettes of Aaron Douglas may have also been evocative in the silhouettes that we can see, here. In the second panel, she's keeping all 4 of those kind of bands together, but you notice that the pictorial representation of Indian women has given way to this abstract kind of design pattern, which has something like the parfleche colors in it, but which also has pinks and purples and other colors, which are part of the Lakota color palette and have a lot to do with red. And then in the bottom panel, she's taken those 4 bands and flipped them on their sides. You can see moving from the outside to the in, sort of feet that would dominate and oppress and stomp down. The figures of modernist anxiety have turned into brown and red triangles and diamonds. The barbed wire of the reservation has turned into the sort of vicious barbed wire of history, the hurts of history. But the color pattern and the colors of the parfleche painting right, emerge and overwrite that barbed wire of history. So in this sense, right, it's a claim to Native autonomy and authority in relation to Native history. So I'm just going to wrap up quickly here by gesturing in 2 different directions to 2 Lakota or Dakota kind of epistemological positions, there is this one interesting letter where the exhibits are actually given a name, the Luta personality prints. And Luta is this interesting word for red or scarlet. There's a everyday word, Shah. So this is Luta is a somewhat special word, right? It has to do with coloring and painting, art, work, honoring people with names. All of these things come together actually in the act of producing aesthetic works, right? That have everything to do with honoring someone, with evoking the color red, with Luta as a personal name, these kinds of things joined together. So we can say is that she is taking Lakota and Dakota artistic traditions, right, and using them to honor people, personalities who she felt were really important and worthy, worthy of honor. The second way to think about it is this: the question of what was called the double woman. And a really wonderful art historian, Janet Catherine Burlow, maybe 15 or 20 years ago, wrote a really important article called "Dreaming of Double Woman," where she took the figure of the double woman and made it as a kind of a trope for thinking about Native women's arts. Double woman was a curious character in Lakota and Dakota sort of cultural meaning, sinister. Ella Deloria described it as. The double woman was a person who was very, very skilled, could be very, very skilled at arts, supernaturally skilled, or maybe sort of the wanton woman who had to live at the edge of the circle of the camp, who was promiscuous, who could take a husband from any man. It's a way of thinking about and explaining kind of social isolation and artistic excellence in the same way. And it may be an apt way for thinking about Mary Sully herself. So two of the things that have been really, really important to me and that I think have been delightful, kind of, at least one, a delightful outgrowth out of this book, is that three of the images are currently in this show, Hearts of Our People. It's currently at the Philbrook in Oklahoma. Native women artists, it's all women artists, curated by women and by Native women predominantly. So three of these images are actually in the show. And when I think of this, and I think of her, the moment when she passed, she hadn't been making this art, and she surely must not have thought that anything would ever have come of her art. She had been trying for years and nothing had really happened. My wife and I went to the opening of this in Minneapolis, and we kind of stood here and quietly wept, I think, at thinking about the long journey of this art and about just the excellence of it and how interesting and how smart and how good it is and how deserving it is really to be part of this larger world of American art, and how gratified, I hope, my great aunt would have been. It also, I think, is interesting that this moment intersects with the moment of the Hilma af Klint show at the Guggenheim. Highly, highly attended show. I've heard it's the best attended show in the history of the Guggenheim. These amazing kind of paintings by a woman who was motivated in some ways by similar things, a spiritual kind of calling, a certain kind of distance from the social world. But the argument, right, that she invented a form of abstraction before all the men came along and Kandinsky and so on and invented an abstraction, the same argument can actually be applied to Mary Sully, right? That the more famous men of the native arts world, Oscar Howe and folks like that, really don't start making their art in abstract forms until the 40s and 50s, after she had already established quite long and lengthy kind of practice. So I think of her in some ways in relation to this woman, Alice Fazende, who was very hard to find. She appears in two tiny little 3-line sort of snippets in little papers. She was the last Confederate widow. She kept a candle burning for a very, very long time, and she lived a very long life. She died finally in 1938. She was completely anonymous and completely unknown, but Mary Sully chose to elevate her and to make her life worthy through her art. And in some ways, that's the opportunity I feel like I've been given, with this project, was to take something that no one was really ever planning to see again, and to sort of make something of it. And I want to be humble about that, because the art itself is the thing that really carries the project and makes it what I think really the best, very, very best project of my career. So with that, I will stop, and I think we'll proceed to conversation.
Wonderful, Philip. Thank you so much. That was such a rich and insightful and very moving presentation. So it now gives me great pleasure to introduce my colleague, Dr. Johanna Minich, who is the assistant curator of Native American art here at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. And Johanna has done two very important exhibitions here. One was called Hear My Voice, Native American Art of the Past and Present, it opened in September 2018, and after its run here, went to the Museum of the Shenandoah Valley in Winchester and the Taubman Museum in Roanoke. And the second exhibition, In Our Own Words, Native Impressions, which was on view from 2019 to 2020 before traveling to the William King Museum. And she's currently working on a third exhibition devoted to Native American printmakers. So Johanna, why don't you take it away with what I'm sure will be a wonderful conversation.
Thank you, Michael. Hi, Phil. It's good to see you again. I wanted to tell you, first of all, what a pleasure it's been to learn about Mary Sully. And full disclosure, I didn't know that much about her work. I was familiar with your writings. I'm very familiar with your father, Vine Deloria Jr. I don't know how many hands I've passed Custer Died for Your Sins into, but it's been a great number. And I've only had this book for a few months, but it's already almost equally dog-eared and sticky noted. And so I have every belief I'm going to be passing this book along to a lot of folks as well. So it's been an absolute joy to see her work and learn more about her. So I'm going to pull up a couple of my own images because I did, it was interesting because I thought, well, I'm going to try to make a connection to some of the art that we have here and as it turns out in our collection. We do have some things that I can bring up to help us kind of talk about her work and her family, of course, as well. We have a Thomas Sully portrait in our own collection, and I just put that next to the family tree so we can, again, be reminded of how this lineage worked. And a quick question popped into my head as I was listening to your talk. I don't know if Mary Sully actually ever saw the portraits that her ancestor had done, that Alfred Sully had done of his, I guess, his wife or his lover. Do you have any idea if she saw those portraits?
I'm pretty sure she didn't see those portraits. I think, they've had a sort of like circuitous kind of life, and they've ended up in, in museum collections. One's at the Jocelyn. The other is perhaps at the Autry. I should know this right off the top of my head, and I don't. But so they're in collections. The original of that black and white study print's actually in a private collection. So I don't think she would have seen those. But they were quite aware of Thomas Sully. I mean, they had sort of tracked the lineage, and they actually spoke to one another and speculated about the possibility that artistic talent would kind of pass through generations. So I feel like she had the sense that there may have been a real kind of connection, genetic or epigenetic, right, in relation to Thomas Sully. So, I mean, I entered this sort of thinking that this was a kind of a smart marketing move. I think I left it thinking it's a more complicated kind of question that they had. And of course, interestingly, in my family, there's been a long series of conversations about what is passed down, what kinds of family obligations are passed down across multiple sorts of generations.
And do you have the actual, the complete collection of personality prints, I guess, is in your private collection, right? With the exception of her ethnographic drawings? Are they all? Because I love that little story in the beginning of your book about how they were sort of rediscovered. That was really interesting to me as well.
They passed from Susie when she died to, which is to say Mary Sully, to her sister Ella. And then when Ella died in the early 1970s to my grandfather. My grandfather, was not completely sure what to do with them. Folks in the family at that moment didn't necessarily take them very seriously. They seemed like an interesting sort of, hobby rather than being seen as like really important kind of art. And it's not hard to imagine why someone might make that mistake. And my grandfather basically sent them to my mom and said, well, you're a librarian, do something library-like with them, catalog them or something, yeah. And so my mom has been, was the caretaker of them, for many, many years before she then passed them my way.
That's great. Well, I'm glad that they're in good hands now and being appreciated by so many of us. But I wanted to bring up a couple of questions, things that I was sort of thinking about when I was reading the book. And so for our viewers, to give us an idea of the kinds of art that we're talking about when we compare Mary Sully's work to other more what we would consider traditional Plains Indian art. When I first started looking at her work, I tended to look at them as related to this very specific gender division that we tend to see in Plains art, where the male-dominated world is all about autobiographical images, very explicit details, pictographic images. The women's art is usually represented by more geometric patterns and motifs that we tend to think of as less biographical, but I would say those of us that look at it know that it carries probably as much cultural weight as the men's art. But I think it's an interesting comparison when you look at, from top to bottom, her works as well. But I did want you to kind of probably correct me on how far off I was when I was looking at those. I think that this makes a nice comparison just because of the, I love this work, the Indian Church, but also this love she had of pageantry and color and pattern that we see so prominently in some of the ledger drawings as well.
I think you're exactly right to think about making those connections. I mean, the Howling Wolf image that you've got here, of course, Howling Wolf is just one of the great sort of artists in the early ledger book, kind of tradition. And there's a lot of them, right? But as you say, right, they are pictorial in nature, and they are personal. They are sort of expressions. But it's also the case, right, that Native women's geometric arts also had personal sort of claims and personal kinds of meanings and moments. It's not the case that Native women are sort of saying, well, I'm going to draw, I'm going to sort of, because I'm beading, I'm going to start with one bead and then have two beads and then have four beads and have six beads, right? And I'm going to make a triangle. It's much, much more complicated and much more thoughtful than that. And particularly with some of I've mentioned the parfleche tradition. Some of these parfleches were literally used as storage, and sometimes this meant communal storage where things would be placed in caches and lots of stuff. So you had to be able to identify your own box, right? So the patterns can be quite distinctive and individualistic in the same way that the men's pictorial tradition can be quite individualistic as well. I mean, I find her this Indian Church is so full of different kinds of images and meanings, and the resonances across, from the top to the middle to the bottom, are just so extraordinary, really. And they, I think in some ways, represent a kind of conversion from that pictorial tradition, into abstraction. I mean, in this one, the bottom panel, it's, I think, entirely reasonable to read these sort of cross designs as quillwork kinds of patterns, a gesture in that direction. So, and quillwork is, sort of the highest and the finest of the arts of, traditional arts of Native Plains, Plains women's. And I would just say, I mean, in the book, I do this like very, very lengthy reading of this particular image because it is so rich, gesturing to the legacy of the family and the church. It's quite personal, in that regard. So her father, Philip Deloria, the person I'm named for, his Lakota name, his Dakota name was Tipi Sapa, right, Black Lodge. And there was a whole vision that his father had about entering Black Lodge or Black Tipi. And so the form of the women entering the teepee and moving around the sides and exiting the rear is drawn directly from the content of that vision, in which he entered a teepee and was forced to choose from one side or the other, and then exited the teepee, at the back. And in the middle panel, you can see that form of a black triangle, of the teepee sapa of a Black Lodge, is right there. It's embedded, in the pattern. And what actually ends up happening, that little figure that's hard to see with the three sort of round circles, is drawn directly from the cross, the Niobrara cross, which was the cross of, Dakota Christianity. So it's super complicated, and it's super interesting and incredibly smart. And you can see her sort of taking the pictorial tradition, making it also abstract and geometrical, in ways that are completely echoing the older traditions.
Yeah, and I was really taken by conceptually how tricky her work is, and also how elegant at the same time. And I know that you spent some time talking about how we can read these essentially from top to bottom, or if we want to give, and I don't think we're trying to give primacy as in first and last, but do you have any indication that it seems pretty clear conceptually that she would have started with the panel on the top and worked her way to the bottom, but is there any idea that she might have started with the lower panel and worked her way into something more complicated?
I mean, it does seem possible. And, I've had friends who come out of different kinds of visual traditions, right? A whole set of colleagues in Taiwan who, for example, have said, well, are you sure you want to read it that way? Maybe there's other ways to read it, So I do think it's possible to imagine it, in other kinds of ways. This image is actually a really good one to sort of think about that. And it's one of the ones I think that has led me to think, well, you read from the top to the bottom. It's a little hard to see, but if you look at the sort of purple robe, I'm pointing at my computer screen right now, I'm afraid.
The purple robe being here.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So down to the bottom of the purple robe, right at the edge of the robe.
The
yeah.
little patterns, the shawls below, yes. Uh-huh.
What we see is this kind of like blue plains or blue kind of woodland floral design,
Yeah.
Sort of native women's design. And if you go down to the second panel, what you can see is like from the little purple edges underneath that black inverted teepee, there's a series of basically what are textiles that are hanging.
Right.
There's a
And
red.
we can actually see it in my little background. It's a little
Yeah.
shaded, but you can actually see them here as well.
It's better in your background. So you can see that like the not the center one and not the second one, but the third one over is literally that plains or that woodlands kind of design. If you go to that, the round circles, red circles in that the textile that's hanging directly, it's that one. If you go back up to the top and you go right to the center, about 1/3 of the way up, you can see a woman who's wearing a red headband, and she's got a red yoke on her dress. Exactly. And so it seems to me like it's quite clear to me she is taking these things from the first image and refiguring them from the second image. And to my mind, it's either you do the first image first or you do the second image and then you do the second image riffing on what you have done, or the conceptual work to have produced the second image and then moved it up to the first image becomes really, really quite daunting. I'm convinced that, she was a genius, in a way that Native women artists, in these abstract traditions, these geometrical traditions, do amazing and fantastic things. And the sort of cognitive work, here is challenging and super, super hard. So it is possible to imagine sort of moving from bottom to top. But as you know, I have reached the opposite conclusion.
Yes, yeah. And I think rightly so. I just think the whole thing is sort of mind-boggling when you really pick them apart and look at how was she actually thinking about this as she was working her way through. It's really impressive. So the next image I wanted to talk about, because we didn't get into it in your talk, but I was also interested in her ethnographic work. And you did mention briefly in the book the various modernist traditions that she would have been aware of, one of which was the Taos School, and Walter Ufer, who's an artist that we have in our own collection, was one of those that tended to take a more sympathetic approach, I think, to recording. It seemed that they were more interested in the culture rather than just what they could glean from it as a motif or a pattern or an inspiration for their art. And I wanted to compare that to one of Mary Sully's ethnographic drawings that she did when she was working with her sister Ella, when she was working with Franz Boas. So I wanted to know if you'd like to touch on that and kind of the importance that the sisters had to one another and their relationship, and how each of those kind of played off on the other's interests and passions, and how that works with the other modernist traditions.
Yeah, I think it's a great juxtaposition. Ufer, and the Taos, the Taos artists are part of that sort of lineage of primitivism, which has European kind of modernist links and has American modernist links, and the Taos artists are quite interesting, right, in the fact that they really do kind of relocate to Taos, which isn't to say they're not quite happy to fly off to Paris, or take a ship over to Paris or whatever. But, so there's a kind of primitivist thing that is uneven, I think, in the Taos artists. Some of them are much more inclined towards, realism, and some of them have, kind of distanced primitivism, and some of them are much closer. when you put that next to sort of what Mary Sully is doing here, this is really ethnographic in the sense that she wants to show, with some precision, a set of artifacts. So one of the things you can see here are things which show up in the art. So if you look at the little girl who's sort of seated, you can see the moccasins. You can see those little kind of toy parfleche boxes below, like the Lunt and Fontaine boxes that I showed you earlier.
Mm-hmm.
You see the little doll. Mary Sully actually at one point made sort of little toy teepees for kids to play with, and tried to sell them. If you look at the girl who's sitting with her back towards us, also the second girl on the ground, you can see those hair ties that are part of some of these other imagery. And if we went back to that Indian history image, right, we can see more or less the same kind of sort of feel, right, of, women, or in this case, girls, right, engaging in sort of domestic play kinds of things on a green grass field with a sort of, there's a sort of idealized kind of quality, quality to it.
Yeah, great. Thank you. I wanted to open the floor to other questions because I don't want to jeopardize all of our time here. So I will escape out of my PowerPoint and bring us back to Michael.
Great. Well, we are encouraging people to write in questions. I don't see any yet, but I will be closely monitoring. So let's see.
So one of the ththings, while we're perhaps waiting for a question or two to come in, Johanna, you also ask about sort of the relationship between the sisters, and I got a little bogged down in the ethnographic kind of dimension of that. But, it's interesting because, there's one way to think about Mary Sully as really the sort of lesser of the two sisters. And in a lot of the stuff that considers Ella, this is sort of the way that she's framed, right? That she's never really, making much of a contribution. And, Ella had to take care of her. Neither of the sisters ever married, right? They were companions with each other for their whole life. They traveled together. They went back and forth between New York City and South Dakota. They lived interesting places. They moved to Tampa for a couple of years at one point. Ella had gone to Oberlin, and they went back to Oberlin, Ohio, and they lived there for a few years, I think because it was inexpensive. They were in northern New Mexico and Arizona doing a study in the late 1930s. They spent a lot of time in South Dakota. So they were together for their whole lives. And I think one of the things I really have wanted to argue in this book is that we should never see that the art itself tells us we cannot see Mary Sully, Susie, as being the lesser of the two sisters, that the sisters were producing this incredible kind of intellectual project and they were doing it together. And to sort of say that is then to see the affinities between these things, to see the ways in which, Mary Sully's art was playing into Ella's ethnography, and Ella's ethnography was playing into the art. For me, one of the great instances of this is one of the very first projects that Franz Boas put Ella on at the beginning was this project overseen by a guy named Otto Kleinberg, who's a social psychologist and who would later be one of the key figures in the Brown v. Board the intellectual infrastructure surrounding that case. So they have this idea to do intelligence testing, and they have an idea that environment and intelligence are linked together. And Ella was interested in this question of intelligence, as well. So the idea was they were going to devise a test that was indexed to American Indian intelligence or cognitive function, and one that was indexed to African American intelligence, and one that was indexed to Appalachian mountaineers, and the regular one, which was like people from New York City. Right? So talking about provincial.
But they're the norm, right?
Yeah, exactly. The norm. And so, Lauren Neal Hurston was actually assigned to do the African American test, and she, I think at that point, that's the moment where she says, this isn't really for me, and she took off for New Orleans and sort of crafted her own kind of career. But Ella actually followed through with this and devised a test for intelligence that would be indexed to Native people. And what was it? It was something that Mary Sully gave her the idea for, which was the memorization of beadwork patterns and sort of triangles and diamonds and these kinds of things. And so there's a really cool letter where Ella is drawing out the pattern which they're going to ask non-native kids to memorize and then reproduce as a form of intelligence testing. So you can see this kind of moment where the sisters had to be in this very intensive kind of dialogue. They were talking all the time. They were exchanging their own intelligence, you know, and so Mary Sully's work completely shows up, I think, in what Ella ends up doing.
Yeah, I almost thought of it as like the Vincent and Theo relationship. You know, I just felt like she was the star. You know, even though Ella was doing the hard work and you know, and the more slogging through and getting the bills paid, Mary was was probably, I don't want to say the star, but she definitely grabbed me more than what Ella was doing, I think. But yeah, I was equally impressed with just the way that they maintained that relationship and how they were able to, you know, go back and take care of their father when it was time to live there, and they were still able to, in some ways, carry on with the things that they were passionate about. So,
yeah, and what's interesting too is that, you know, there is this sort of sense, well, you know, Ella had to take care of Mary, and that's in some ways kind of true around the financial aspect of it. But, you know, Ella also crafted a role for her, you know, as her driver. She drove, and she was actually, you know, by all accounts, she was a kind of a mechanic, you know, that she would open the, you know, hood of the car and get under there and fix things. So, I mean, they're quite extraordinary women, I think.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so I'm seeing a question.
It looks like you have a question.
Yeah.
What?
The question is how the
Here we
mechanics.
go.
Yeah, Michael? Oh, there it is. It appears on the screen.
It appeared on our screen from Anna Moser, who would love to hear more about the mechanics of how you wrote this book in terms of your research and the interesting connections you may have made and the length of time it took you.
So, you know, my mom and I, you know, after my dad passed, my mom, 2005, my mom and I went back and sort of started looking at this art. And so in the sort of 2006 period or so, I was starting to think a bit more about it. And there was a seminar between the National Museum of the American Indian and the American Art Gallery, or the National Gallery rather. And for some reason I agreed to give a paper and I had no idea what I was going to do the paper. And I thought, you know, I'm going to just talk about some of this art and I'm going to show some art. And at that point, several art historians said, you know, you really have something interesting, you know, here. And I had at that time thought it was kind of a one-off. But I've always really liked the art. What I realized that it was not that, but I was doing academic administration at the time. And so I developed the project in a very, you know, kind of peculiar way, which was, I kind of started doing it as a talk. And I went out and I did it as a talk and people would react to it and I would think more about it and I'd think about their reactions and I'd come back and I'd revise the talk and I'd give it 6 months later and then I'd go and give another talk. And so for years while I was an administrator, I was just kind of doing this as a talk. And then a day came when I was not an administrator and I sat down to sort of figure out what was, I think, a super amazing 50-minute talk could be converted, you know, into a book. And the talk was full of these little reveals and kind of like little kind of tricks and kind of things, you know, and of course it didn't really fit the structure of the book, but I didn't quite know that at the time. I wrote about 300 some pages of the book. It really wasn't working in terms of its form and structure. This is probably way too much detail, but I'll say it quickly. I wrote down the thesis statement of every paragraph on long series of paper. I put them on the walls of, you know, our bedroom. I laid on the floor for 2 days, kind of looking at it, sort of thinking like, what was the argument and the nature of the argument? How would it be best presented? I reformatted all kinds of stuff. I moved it all around and I did a whole nother edition of it. So I got serious about it, you know, in that sense, in maybe, you know, 4 or 5 years ago. And then I was very lucky to work with folks at the University of Washington Press, who I think did a quite wonderful job at high quality, you know, good paper, high quality reproduction, you know, all of these kinds of things. So that was the sequence of the book.
Yeah, I noticed that too. It would be a very different book if you hadn't had all those color illustrations. They did a great job with the layout. It's a beautiful book.
Yeah, it really is.
Yeah, the design is fantastic, you know, and it's And I was really worried at how well it would translate, because the paper's a little frail. It's colored pencil. Sometimes when you put a camera on colored pencil and sort of you get really focused on it, it doesn't look so good. But these things really do come out looking quite well, I think, quite wonderful. So there's another question about what kinds of subjects, if she were working today, would be showing up in her work, and that's a great question. It's pretty interesting. There's a lot of people from the film world. So I think we could imagine a set of film actors, who would maybe show up, in her work. And I'm not quite sure, who those folks might be specifically. Would it be Meryl Streep? Would it be Tom Cruise? I'm not totally sure, but I think we can imagine folks, probably because she liked people who were a little quirky, right? Probably, folks in the film world who were sort of not maybe mainstream stars, but who were a little bit off the, maybe a little bit off the beaten track. She's also very, very interested in music. And she was really interested in classical music as it crossed over and in figures who kind of went back and forth. So we might imagine some interesting kind of musical figures who also would be sort of big thinking, kinds of folks, there. Figures from the church, there might be some folks that she kind of would pull out there. It's curious to me that, she's a visual artist, and this is a world full of sort of, kind of celebrity visual artists, who are starting to become celebrated in the mass media. And she only draws one artist, and it's an artist who's completely anonymous. Her name's Annie Stein, and she's a artist in New York City who's sort of goes to the Art Students League and takes some classes and shows at, kind of local libraries, and that's it. And I think there may have been a patronage kind of hoped for patronage relationship there. But so it's curious that no artists, are actually part of the collection themselves. So I don't know. I mean, it's all a guess, right? Who she would be,
I'm going to guess Venus and Serena Williams. I think that she would love athletes. I think that she would love the sisterhood. And I think that, I was impressed that she gave almost equal time to female celebrities, so she was paying attention. She was giving a voice to the women, and some of the really, she mentioned, I don't remember the name of the person who was the first outwardly gay female. Was she a theater personality?
Yeah.
People that were not afraid to, put themselves out there. And so.
Yeah, her dealing with it. So Patsy Kelly is this person, right? And she's a super interesting person as an out lesbian, right, in Hollywood, where, in Hollywood at this time is a time of kind of astonishing sexual fluidity, but she's, her claim to fame is she's with this very famous, female impersonator, and they drive their car off the pier in Santa Monica. And, so she's this really, really interesting, kind of person. And there's a number of folks, right, who fit these kind of categories of people who are on the social margins, for various kinds of, kinds of reasons. Yeah, I'll say period after that, I guess.
Well, thank you, Ann Henderson. That was a great question. I was also struck by the Sir Malcolm Campbell image and the way that you unpack that. And of course, it relates also to your earlier work about Native Americans in that early 20th century and that car culture. So she might have had some racing drivers in there.
Well, you think about her as a person who is like intimately familiar with cars. I mean, and of course he makes complete sense, right? When you see the picture of that car, you can't help but think like that's the coolest thing ever, and if I'm my sister's driver, I'm thinking, that's my car, right? I want that, I want that car.
Yeah, well, he was the fastest man on earth at that time.
Yeah.
So have you thought about what you're going to do with this collection? It must also be, I mean, part of it is so great that it's now got this public presence, but that there's also like what's going to happen. Like they're now being discovered. You said they're on an exhibition in Indianapolis, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, I was so naive about this, after this sort of Smithsonian thing, and I started to really fall in love with the art and sort of make sense of it. And I went to my friends who were curators, and I was like, hey, isn't this the coolest thing ever? You should do a show. And they're like, no. You don't get to come to us and say, oh, my kind of half crazy great aunt has left a box of art in the basement and we're going to do a show in my big museum. It's like, they're like, it just doesn't work that way. I'm like, but look at it, it's so cool. And they're like, yeah, it still doesn't really work that way, you know. And I talked to my colleagues at the Smithsonian, you know, who, so I've been on the board of trustees, and they were like, well, this is a big conflict of interest. And this is, I became to understand something about the pressure the curators are sometimes under as they're putting together shows from folks who would like to have their art in shows. And they're like, well, these are issues that you don't really fully understand. What you should do is go off and write a book and convince us, you know, that this is worthy of, you know, kind of a museum show. And so I have been working with a couple of curators in a couple of different places, and we're sort of thinking about what that looks like. And of course, COVID slowed everything down. And of course, museums have very long lead times around these kinds of things. But we're planning to do, you know, I'm hoping that there'll be a single artist show that's really, you know, kind of focused on her, but which will also engage a lot of contemporary Native artists and Native women artists and artists from Standing Rock, you know, in particular, you know, and some of the other Dakota and Lakota, you know, kinds of reservations. So
keep my number. Good.
Okay.
Now, we have another question. So Laurie Stapp is asking, do any non-Native modernist artists come to mind who may have been influenced by Native geometric design? And do you think that this type of Native patterning influenced Art Deco? Thanks, gorgeous work.
Yeah, this is such a great question, and this is where, you know, I get to reveal myself as not an art historian. I mean, one of the things I've worried about this book is falling between the cracks, right? Because I don't actually, you know, I'm an American Studies guy who's delving into art. You know, I mean, Art Deco is such a big, broad, baggy kind of, you know, kind of formation, right? But it does seem likely to me that there's an interplay here, you know, kind of back and forth between, you know, I mean, there's a whole tradition of sort of like European modernists sort of grabbing the African tradition, and American modernists sort of grabbing the sort of native tradition. And, you know, one of the things I try to talk about in the book a little bit is, you know, some of these early shows, early 1930s shows, you know, in New York City, which are kind of explicitly about taking Native arts and bringing it to New York and letting, you know, kind of New York modernists, you know, kind of have a look at it and sort of build things, you know, off of this. So it's not the case to me that, you know, I am not necessarily thinking like, oh, that artist and this, you know, kind of thing, but it does feel to me like the affect and the feel of the geometries, you know, of these things are part of the kind of structural feeling, right, of the work, you know, of those kinds of, you know, those kinds of moments. And Deco is probably a pretty decent place to, you know, to look for it.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, I think we might be wrapping up.
Well, there's one more question, it looks like, on the screen now.
Yeah, I'm not seeing them on my screen. Can you read it out?
Sure. It's from Dawn Greggs. She says, in my 1970s BFA training, I was taught about Native American artists' craft, not fine art. Native American art by women was beadwork, textiles, and pottery. There wasn't much information about the artist, but much more about the object. Has that changed much?
Yeah, so this is Patrice Owens Parker. I mean, this is exactly the way that my understanding that sort of contemporary exhibition practice is heading, is like to de-anonymize this art as much as possible, right? I mean, and a lot of very thoughtful folks have said, look, you know, we've just been lazy about this, right? To sort of say, well, this is an anonymous artist, you know, from the 19th century, and we don't know really who it is. And it's like that lots of folks are saying that just doesn't really wash anymore, right? That like we can work harder at this, and we can discover these, and we can not let this sort of be anonymous, and we can sort of reclaim and recapture, you know, the names of Native women who are producing this art. And so I think this has changed. I mean, there's obviously been this sort of sense, some of this stuff from the 30s, the discourse is really interesting, you know, of is it art, is it craft? The folks who want to make the argument that it is art are really quite strident, right? This is art, the Indian is a natural artist, a sort of natural modernist, a sort of natural sort of master of form and shape and color, right? I mean, so they're using a Western arts vocabulary to make the argument that native arts are arts. At the same time, right, the Arts and Crafts Board and other kinds of mechanisms are really framing it as craft. That is to say, as low-end commodity kind of image production. You know, and so I think those things exist in this sort of weird tension. Nowadays, though, I think you're quite right to sort of point to changes. The Hearts of Our People show is a really, really great example of sort of surfacing the connections between older aesthetic traditions and art traditions and production on the part of Native women and contemporary ones. And putting those two in dialogue, right, forces us to go back, I think, and reevaluate the older sort of canon of Native American women's arts.
And
Thanks.
I would say also, as a curator, you know, one of our big challenges with the historic pieces when we don't know the artist is coming up with the proper wording for the labels too. And so that has changed a lot. We have a lot of conversations about the best way to present it as a work by a person rather than just a culture. You know, decades ago, it was just sort of like Northwest Coast ladle, you know, and it never even specified that it was made by a human person. And so we do have these conversations constantly where even if you don't know the name of the artist, it is a person who lived and created. And so that has certainly changed the way that we talk about people that we may not know their names, but we know that they're very much present in the conversation. So,
Yes.
Yeah, there's just an enormous sea change and reckoning going on. You think about Geesban quilts and how, you know, quilts were always relegated. It wasn't considered fine art, and everything has changed. And I love, Philip, that you brought up Hilma af Klint, because I saw that show and it was totally depressing that in all of I'm kind of a modern art specialist. I was never taught an artist as important as that. And as you say, we need to work harder. People in Sweden knew her work, but it had not entered that mainstream canon. I think that's what we're really doing, is we're cracking open this and bringing in new artists and new voices. And it's just so exciting. I think your book is timely and necessary.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, this is the way the book ends, right? Is to say, if we sit in the present moment and we go back and imagine an artist in the 1930s that no one ever heard of in the 30s, that no one has heard of until the present moment, is it possible to imagine that that artist from the 30s that no one has ever heard of can actually change the entire narrative of art? And of course, the argument is absolutely yes.
Yes. Well, maybe that's a good point to end on. I don't see any more questions in the chat. But thank you, Johanna and Philip. That was really amazing.
Thank you so much. I can't tell you what a pleasure it is to be here and to talk about this. And again, how honored I am by the award. It really does. You can't see me sort of doing this, but it really kind of, it's quite wonderful. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for an absolutely outstanding program this evening. Philip, thank you for writing such an amazing book, one that has just opened up new vistas for all of us. And thank you to Joanna and Michael for such stimulating conversation. I hope you will join us again tomorrow evening for our final event in our week-long celebration of writing and writers. And that is for the 23rd Annual Literary Awards celebration, at which we will be announcing all of the winners of the library's literary awards this year. You will hear from our featured speaker, who's a wonderful, outstanding historian, Douglas Brinkley. And most importantly, you'll get to experience the incomparable Virginia writer, Adriana Trigiani, who once again this year will be hosting our annual event. So we hope to see you tomorrow evening. And we also hope to see you again soon at the Library of Virginia and the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. So have a wonderful rest of your evening. And thank you for being with us tonight.